Right, so it's getting better and better. Now we're going to have a talk about the future that we actually want to see. This presentation is called Web3 is Solarpunk, Reimagining Public Goods. I would like to welcome to the stage Scott Moore of Gitcoin. And I think Scott is also embodying like the idea behind this conference and this whole movement, because not only he's such a smart blockchain brain, but also he's an avid piano player and composer. And he just confessed to me that he even has got the Erdish number of 3, which I don't understand. I don't know, maybe he gets into this when he has time. But anyway, I give the stage to you. Welcome and enjoy, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Test, everyone can hear me okay, great. Thank you so much. So today I'm here to talk about, I think, a very relevant subject for most of the people in this room. When we talk about Web3, I think in a lot of conferences, we talk about the technology, we talk about sort of the immutability, the hope for the future and sort of that capacity. But I think the future that I'm hoping we can talk about today is more around sort of the narrative vision that we're actually driving towards with Web3. And what that means for the future, both of the ecosystem and also just of, hopefully society at large. And so I'll kind of break this into 4 sections. What is Solarpunk? Why does it matter? Why does this matter for public goods and the way we fund them in particular? And then how do we build a more Solarpunk future? So when we think about sort of the history of these movements, I think the most obvious to people here is probably Cyberpunk. And Cyberpunk comes from sort of a rich history all the way back to sort of like the new sci-fi movement in the 60s and 70s. But we think of it principally as a movement that has existed in sort of the minds of a lot of filmmakers, a lot of writers, especially in the 1980s, books like Neuromancer, movies like Blade Runner. There's a lot of historical reference to this sort of high-tech, low-life, sort of almost subterranean model of living in which we have, megacorps that are governing most of our behavior, and we're sort of, hopefully, even in that world, just the fading rebel alliance that's sort of pushing back against that. And that's, kind of dystopian when you think about it. I don't think that's actually a future that we want to, necessarily end up in, but it is the future that's most prominent in the media that we see today. And the Cypherpunk movement largely arose from that movement in the 1980s into the 1990s, where you had things like the sort of Cypherpunk Manifesto that led to a sort of conversation around privacy and around how we can kind of fight back against these theoretical powers that be. And this was actually quite a useful movement in the sense that it gave us sort of a sense of agency and a sense of purpose fighting against these external forces. But it did so in a way that actually sort of pitted us against each other and created a very individualistic way of looking at the world, in which you have this sort of lone hacker who has the capacity to save the world on their own without the help of anyone else. And ultimately, that sort of led to a lot of the social movements we see that surround the way we think about technology today. Solarpunk, by contrast, is fundamentally high-tech and high-life. It believes that we can actually work together collectively to create some of this change instead of worrying about ways to individually kind of be superheroes in our own stories. And this, to me, is the narrative shift that we need to work towards in Web3, and it's actually kind of fitting that we would do so because the technology itself is fundamentally collaborative. So when we think about this world, I think we have to start to be more explicit that it's something we want to work against and move away from. And when we think of this world, I think we need to be more explicit about the fact that it's something that we should strive for and try to achieve. So we want to emphasize this deep integration between the environment and humanity, and not sort of have this constant tension between different groups or constant tension between ourselves and the environment that we exist in, which I think historically has been what a lot of more sort of cyberpunk accelerationist sort of technology perspectives have been about. So conservation, self-sustainability, social inclusiveness are all kind of core principles of this philosophy, which largely actually arose in sort of 2008. It's relatively new, but I think is actually quite interesting for us to be able to develop independently and sort of evolve in the context of Web3. So when I say it is an important philosophy for us to think about. What do I mean? Like, why do we care about this particular philosophy in the context of Web3, beyond the sort of cooperative nature of the tooling that we're building? I think we have the ability to actually frame the problems we face mostly as coordination problems vis-a-vis other existing institutional frameworks for coordination. And those include things like nation states. Those include things like corporations. They include other large-scale sort of institutions that we rely on, even things like universities, which have their own sort of like problems and sort of bloat today. Those institutions are not necessarily bad. I will not go as far as to say that we should totally dismantle all of them. I'm not here to make that case today, but I am here to make the case that we can push back on these being the only means of social coordination, and that by having, for the first time, a way to coordinate collectively while being decentralized, rather than coordinating collectively while centralized or coordinating individually while decentralized, gives us the opportunity to sort of just reframe and create a new beginning. So we want to reverse these trends of increasing institutional power without really any checks, and we want to do that while re-examining the history that we've gone through, because when we look back even at the history of the corporation and the history of the nation state, these are things that are relatively new in their current conception. These are not just themselves immutable kind of systems. These are systems that have been built intentionally by people who are probably no smarter than the people in this room. We all have the power to actually create systems that are of this level of complexity if we work together, and to do so in a way that is actually probably more fair and ultimately more just for the world at large. So we need to move beyond this baggage, this assumption that we can just kind of work with these institutions and leave ourselves focused on problems and sort of solutions from the past. And we need to think about ways that we can evolve our sort of models for the future. And one model that actually is relatively new, I think it was 2009 or so when Ostrom was really recognized for this work, is the commons management model, which outlines kind of 8 core principles, which I will admit I don't have full time to get into here, but that actually allow local commons, local communities to govern resources that might be, on the face of it, it's scarce, towards their own ends. So, for example, fisheries, forests, or even open source software and Web3 are examples, in a sense, of commons that we all sort of share, we all rely on. And we typically rely on large-scale institutions to govern those as well. But that, to me, is actually something that even before Web3 we showed wasn't necessarily the only way to go about fixing or solving these problems. So ultimately, Ostrom, to me, is just one of the things that we can start to lean on as a model beyond those institutions that fits into this Solarpunk framework of being kind of collaborative with our environment. A similar set of principles that I think is important to draw on is Rochdale, which is kind of the sort of original starting point for cooperativism in sort of modern society that we're familiar with. And ultimately, the goal of cooperativism versus commons management is that you're trying to create voluntary, participatory, open membership that is equal among members, that allows anyone to have some sort of skin in the game and participate in basically a set of arrangements towards the kind of collective benefit of those cooperative members. And ultimately, in turn, which we'll get to in a second, both of these models do a very good job of creating positive externalities for communities beyond their local kind of shared needs. And this is important because it's very difficult to scale the 2 models I just mentioned relative to the existing centralized institutions that we have today. Those institutions benefit by the fact that after a certain amount of time or a certain amount of scale with Dunbar's number, we sort of lose a sense of solidarity and connection to each other. We lose the ability to coordinate. We start thinking about ourselves as kind of atomic units again, or as part of our local communities, not as part of a broader society. And what you see happen is that effectively, over time, we acquiesce to the idea that we don't, have the power to work together in a decentralized way to solve these problems. We start saying, actually, it's a lot easier for us to just rely on a large centralized institution to do this stuff for us. And what I'm sort of here to say is that, we can take back agency and ownership over our institutions. We can use these coordination tools to fight for causes we believe in. We can mint our own cooperative currencies to help fight in this direction. And we can design novel incentive mechanisms with those currencies to be regen not degen. So what does this actually mean for public goods? Well, historically, Paul Samuelson in the 1950s created this conception of public goods, which you see here, which kind of outlines 4 main categories, and they're kind of defined by whether or not the good is excludable or rivalrous. And what that just means is that you can or can't take it away from people, or you can and can't basically, one person's use of the good does or does not take away from someone else's use of the good. And the interesting note about Samuelson's definition is that many things that he considers public goods are actually meant to be this almost extreme edge case. And a lot of that historical reference, the context was basically Samuelson trying to make the case that a lot of these things should be handled by private institutions rather than by any kind of public group. And it's interesting because even the examples here, like infrastructure, are largely local needs. A road or bridge is only useful to those people that live in that community or that are able to have access to that community. Many people, for whatever reason, may not be able to access, a road or bridge, or they may not have a license to access a road or bridge or whatever. Any of those sort of things we consider public goods often are considered public because they're provisioned by some large-scale institution like a state, rather than being considered public just because we have agreed that we're collectively, in sort of a shared need with respect to that good. So what I think we should probably start to do, and what we've been talking about both on the Gitcoin side and in other communities across Web3, is redefining public goods in this sort of Solarpunk conception to principally discuss the positive externalities that a good creates. So when we think about positive externalities, we're thinking about things that benefit a broader community than the group that is generating the good itself. So an example would even be public education. The more educated a society is, the better off that society will be. And it's not just the university that is benefiting necessarily from those educated students. And we have many examples of this across society, but we often fail to consider these things as deserving of our kind of attention or support because we assume that they will be provisioned by others. But very often this is not the case. Kernel is an example of a project that I think is absolutely deserving of more funding and is sort of in this process of evolving in order to be a sort of Web3 university. And I think that they're sort of looking at that model in this sort of positive externalities framework. I think similarly, there's a lot of Web3 tooling that would not necessarily be funded in Web 2, for example, like most open source software, because people don't see a reason to go and fund the maintainer who is kind of holding up the weight of these different institutional software solutions on their shoulders, because they can just free ride on this for as long as they want. Whereas in Web 3, you have shared incentives and shared currencies that allow people to feel incentivized to work on these things together and to basically share in the value that that software creates. So if we redefine from this sort of model back here, public goods into something that really is focused on positive externalities, we start to increase the scope of things that we're considering good for the public in a real sense. And by doing that, we actually produce more things that we can fund via these shared currencies, via Web3 technology. And so this to me is a fundamental kind of part of the Solarpunk narrative. And I think, rather than worrying about these individual kind of like, super hackers, super shadowy coders that are doing work on their own, we should be worrying about the shared libraries, the shared technology, the shared infrastructure, and then even the shared sort of, physical spaces, including the environment that we all rely on and we all work within. And that is fundamentally what we would want to do if we were to follow Ostrom's principles and work within the Commons framework. So as the talk suggests, I'm here to sort of say Web3 is not just this sort of speculative game. It is actually building new kinds of regenerative ecosystems, and regen is fundamentally Solarpunk. I think that this is a fundamental unlock for us in terms of how we think about the future we want to build, and hopefully even for people in this room, it's something that can guide you in terms of how you build your projects in the future. And so here's a few examples of just projects that I'm personally excited about that are very much driving in this direction. On the one hand, you have digital identity tools like ENS, which are available to anyone, can be defined by even sort of different community needs. You can basically have people opt in and out based on their ENS. You start to identify people as individuals, but also, for example, through shared NFTs as members of a community. ENS, of course, has sort of done this with their DAO and sort of evolved even just what it means to be part of the ENS community on that front. Decentralized storage is really fundamentally about giving people agency over their data, giving people kind of what I would call like shared ownership and sort of like in context of the DWeb principles, which I again don't have a lot of time to get into, but I would definitely recommend people check out. And then of course the core things that I'm focused on and the things that I think are fundamentally important for all of us here are how we do more sort of retroactive public goods funding, quadratic funding, other forms of community-first funding that don't rely on these larger scale pools of capital, but rely on our own sort of interest in solving for our own shared needs. And ultimately, to me, this is, kind of all reliant on what the governance models that we're making are. So I really wanted to shout out to Gnosis as well as being one of the tooling providers that's doing a lot of work in kind of creating these fractal governance models so people can fund and sustain themselves over time. The big challenge to me with a lot of, what we've done in the last, 20, 30 years actually comes back to sort of, David Graeber's work about like the notion of kind of two things: bullshit jobs, which is a great sort of like piece by Graeber, and then also this notion that we haven't imagined, a future that we want to see. In fact, we've like done worse. We've imagined these dystopian futures. But if we collectively kind of map our preferences using things like QF, using things like retro public goods funding, which I can get into in a little bit more detail afterwards for anyone that wants to talk about them. But the idea is essentially creating these democratic mechanisms that allow people to individually fund things that they care about and then direct pools of funding from other larger groups according to their preferences rather than, as it often works the other way around. We can actually start to design for that sort of Solarpunk vision in a grassroots way, and I think that's critically important. We've done this a lot in Gitcoin actually already. We've done this 14 times. The 14th round just ended, and the 13th is the one that we kind of have the final results from, given there's a few technical details that I won't get into around Sybil resistance and so forth that we always need to check at round end. So the 14 results will be out soon. But the idea here is that we're trying to basically let communities, grassroots, create their own rounds, create their own pools, and then support them with what we're calling kind of the main round. And these cause rounds for things like the climate, things like, in the context of GR13, the crisis in Ukraine, and things like longevity that certain communities in Web3 care a lot about. Having these different local needs basically bubble up in the sense that Ostrom kind of intended allows us to actually create kind of global commons rather than just one sort of like set of local commons. And that to me is kind of the interesting part of these rounds. It's also the interesting part of the work that Optimism is doing on that front. But ultimately the goal is that by stacking these sort of impact DAOs together, we all sort of benefit globally for our shared needs. And we actually have a lot of posts on our governance forum, gov.gitcoin.co, that go into more detail on this. But I would highly recommend people look at, in their own projects, how they can be part of this sort of stack and how their project can be a kind of impact DAO that might run a quadratic funding round or might run its own retro PGF round or might even build its own modular tooling to do these things, because ultimately then you become part of this collective movement and you're not just working on your own. And of course, we do have like some stuff that we've written about this. The public goods funding workstream, along with Kevin and Ale, who's here, have written a great book just about the ideas of impact DAOs and what we're talking about when we talk about making impact. One thing that is still an unsolved question in the space, which I highly encourage people to think about, and what we've been thinking about, is how we measure that impact via things like impact certificates or via other sorts of Web3 on-chain mechanisms for the sort of like long-term understanding of, basically just to ensure that we don't fall into the same traps as I talked about at the beginning, and actually check ourselves and make sure we're not, overhyping things as may have happened in the last bull market to some extent. So I would highly recommend people just take a look at this and review it in passing. But since I only have 20 seconds, I will say we can choose to build a Solarpunk future. I think, as Graeber said, we can choose to do better than imagining a future that we hate. We can actually focus in on funding our shared needs, building for a future where we're collectively working together with our environment. And I think, in that sense, as I've said, Web3 is Solarpunk. So thank you very much. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach me afterwards. And thank you again.